and Ms. Joyce Masuya, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Miroslav Janša.
Briefed the Security Council on the situation in Ukraine last time a little more than a month ago. Since then, the daily barrage of Russian missiles and drones against Ukrainian cities and towns has continued to intensify with devastating consequences for the civilian population. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, in June, civilian casualties in Ukraine reached a 3-year high. In the first half of the year alone, 6,754 civilians were killed or injured. According to Ukrainian authorities, so far in July, the Russian Federation has launched at least 5,183 long-range munitions against Ukraine, including a record number of 728 long-range drones on 9 July. In recent weeks, the capital city of Kyiv and the historic port city of Odessa have been especially heavily impacted by the daily attacks involving massive swarms of hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles. And while frontline areas of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Sumy, Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk regions of Ukraine remain particularly dangerous for civilians, nowhere is safe in Ukraine. Over the last few weeks, civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure have also been reported in western Ukrainian regions of Lviv, Volyn, Chernivtsi, as well as in Lutsk and Ivano-Frankivsk, with the last two cities reportedly experiencing their heaviest aerial attacks of the war. Across the country, attacks have struck hospitals, schools, energy and transport infrastructure, and residential buildings. On 21st July, a massive Russian aerial strike on Kiev reportedly caused damage to a metro station where hundreds were seeking shelter. The same attack reportedly set a kindergarten on fire and damaged a multi-story residential building, resulting in dozens of civilian casualties. On 11 July, Russian drones hit the city center of Kharkiv, reportedly damaging a maternity ward at the country's second largest hospital, forcing mothers with newborns to flee. On 24 June, a countrywide Russian drone and missile attack reportedly struck a passenger train and damaged more than 40 schools and kindergartens, a cathedral, 8 medical centers and hospitals, and several residential buildings. At least 21 people were reportedly killed and more than 300 injured. The same devastating scene was repeated during another record-level attack across Ukraine on 29 June. In total, since the beginning of the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, OHCHR has verified that at least 13,580 civilians, including 716 children, have been killed. 34,115 civilians, including 2,173 children, have been injured. My colleague, Assistant Secretary General Joyce Msuya of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs will provide updates about the impacts of the escalating attacks on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Mr. President, we are also concerned about the increasing number of reported civilian casualties reportedly resulting from Ukrainian drone attacks inside the Russian Federation. According to Russian officials, Ukrainian drone attacks in recent weeks have led to civilian casualties in the Belgorod, Kursk, Bryansk, Voronezh, Kaluga, Lipetsk, and Tula regions of the Russian Federation. Moscow and St. Petersburg have also been targeted with dozens of drones, reportedly causing severe disruptions to air traffic. Following one such recent series of attacks between 5 and 7 July, over 2,000 flights were reportedly disrupted in multiple Russian airports, including in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Nizhny Novgorod. The United Nations, however, is not in a position to verify these reported incidents in the Russian Federation, including any reports of civilian casualties. International law clearly prohibits attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. We strongly condemn all such attacks, wherever they occur. They must end immediately. Mr. President, the intensified aerial attacks and fighting on the ground continue to pose a significant threat to the safety and security of Ukraine's nuclear sites. On 11 July, a drone attack reportedly hit the city hall in Enerhodar, where most of the staff of Ukraine's Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, ZNPP, live, located only about 5 kilometers from the plant. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, the reported drone attack followed reports of an overnight shooting incident near the ZNPP on 12 July. On 4 July, IAEA raised concerns over the reported loss by ZNPP of all its off-site power for several hours. Meanwhile, Ukraine's operating nuclear power plants, Khmelnytsky, Rivne, and South Ukraine, also regularly report of drones being detected near the sites. These latest incidents underline the fragility of nuclear safety and security during the war and the need to ensure sustained attention to this issue. We continue to urge the sides to act responsibly. Any nuclear incident must be avoided at all costs. Mr. President, already at the end of last year, the total cost of reconstruction and recovery in Ukraine was assessed at $524 billion over the next decade. The most recent escalation of attacks is quickly adding to this toll. In this regard, this year's Ukraine Recovery Conference that took place in Rome earlier this month represented a significant milestone in the international community's commitment to supporting Ukraine's long-term reconstruction. The event culminated in over $11 billion in pledged funding. Speaking on behalf of the Secretary General, acting UNDP Administrator Hao Liang-shu reaffirmed the UN's commitment to supporting Ukraine to rebuild stronger, from advancing green energy and mine action to supporting community resilience. It is crucial that the international solidarity with Ukraine is sustained as the country embarks on its long journey for recovery. Mr. President, on Wednesday, Ukrainian and Russian delegations met in Istanbul for the third time this year. We welcome the continuation of these direct contacts between the sides and urge Ukraine and the Russian Federation to make further progress towards a ceasefire and a lasting settlement. We are grateful for the meaningful efforts of Turkey, the United States, and other relevant actors to help sustain the necessary diplomatic momentum. We commend in particular the reported progress made in the humanitarian track of these talks, including with regards to exchanges of prisoners and of war and civilian detainees. Since last May, following the first two rounds of negotiations in Istanbul, the Russian Federation and Ukraine have already reportedly exchanged hundreds of prisoners of war, including those badly injured, as well as more than 7,000 mortal remains. Each such exchange and repatriation alleviates the pain of the affected families and serves as a reminder that diplomacy can work. We therefore call on the sides to continue such exchanges. Mr. President, on Tuesday, this Council unanimously adopted a resolution reiterating that all states shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means through dialogue, diplomatic engagement, and cooperation in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered. The resolution also underscored the importance of the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women and meaningful participation of youth in dispute resolution efforts. As the Secretary General stated during that meeting, diplomacy may not have always succeeded in preventing conflicts, violence, and instability, but it still holds the power to stop them. With this in mind, and recalling the Security Council Resolution 2774 of 2025, adopted in February, it is crucial that the momentum of the ongoing diplomatic contacts is not only sustained, but reinforced by genuine political will to make tangible progress towards ending the current dangerous cycle of escalation as soon as possible. The heartbreaking and rising human toll of the past nearly 3.5 years of war underscores the urgency of a complete, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire as the first step towards a just and lasting peace. A peace that is in line with the UN Charter, international law, and the relevant UN resolutions, and that respects the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We remain ready to support all meaningful efforts to this end. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Jancha for his briefing. I now give the floor to Madame Joyce Msuya.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for the opportunity to brief the Council once again on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, along with Assistant Secretary General Jenka. Since our last update to this Council on 20 June, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine has continued to deteriorate sharply. Over the past week, renewed waves of missile and drone strikes have devastated lives and infrastructure across multiple regions, as already outlined by Assistant Secretary General Jenka. According to the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, the scale and speed of civilian harm remain alarmingly high. In the first half of 2025, nearly 50% more civilian casualties were recorded compared to the same period last year. Over the past day, authorities report strikes on urban centers, including Cherkasy, Kharkiv, and Odessa, killed 5 civilians and injured 93, among them 11 children, as hostilities intensify nationwide. Last weekend, attacks struck populated areas in Dnipro, Kharkiv, and Sumy, reportedly killing dozens of people and injuring more than 70, including children. In Kharkiv, a rehabilitation center for people with disabilities was hit. In Kiev, a kindergarten, a metro station, shops, and residential buildings were damaged. In the Ivano-Frankivsk region, once seen as a refuge far from the front lines and home to many displaced families, we saw the largest attack there since the war escalated in 2022. There is no safe place left in Ukraine. These are the latest in a series of attacks that have brought even more fear and suffering to communities, both near the front lines and far from them. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas, including long-range missiles and drones, remains a key driver of civilian harm. Mr. President, civilians in Ukraine continue to bear the heaviest burden, struggling to access food, water, power, and health care. Nearly 13 million people need assistance, but limited funding means we can reach only a fraction of them. For many displaced women and girls, safety remains out of reach. Risks of violence at home, in shelters, and during evacuations continue. Yet, the local women-led groups best placed to help are scaling back due to funding shortfalls, leaving countless women without the protection they so urgently need. Displacement from frontline areas continue to rise. Since April, more than 26,000 people fleeing hostilities have registered at transit centers. In response, our partners are working with authorities to open new sites in the Sumy and Dnipro regions to meet rising needs. Across Ukraine, 3.7 million people remain displaced, with nearly 6 million refugees abroad. Additionally, unverified reports in recent days and weeks indicate civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure in the regions of Kursk, Bryansk, Belgorod, Voronezh, Kaluga, Lipetsk, and Tula regions in the Russian Federation. Under international humanitarian law, all parties must take all feasible precautions to avoid and minimize civilian harm. Mr. President, the continued use of anti-personnel mines puts civilian lives and livelihoods at risk every day. The Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention strictly prohibits their use. Under this convention, states have agreed that the harm caused by these weapons is unacceptable and that considerations of humanity must impose limits on their use. We cannot go back. This is why we note with alarm the recent decree by the Ukrainian president announcing Ukraine's withdrawal from the convention. This follows the regrettable decisions of neighboring countries to withdraw from this convention. Assertions of exceptional threats and military necessity cannot outweigh international humanitarian law, which seeks to limit human suffering precisely when a state is fighting against its enemy. The Secretary General has urged all states to adhere to humanitarian disarmament treaties and immediately halt any steps towards their withdrawal. Mr. President, despite relentless risks, our humanitarian partners in Ukraine continue their vital work, reaching more than 3.6 million people with emergency health care, shelter, clean water and cash to families since January. But access remains precarious. In regions such as Kherson and Donetsk, intensified fighting has forced aid convoys to be delayed or suspended, putting humanitarian workers at risk and interrupting life-saving support. We remain committed to ensuring all necessary arrangements are in place to reach people in need safely and without obstruction. Our ability to reach an estimated 1.5 million civilians in areas under the control of the Russian Federation, including parts of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, remains extremely limited and increasingly difficult. It is not for lack of capacity or will, but rather persistent access impediments that prevent us from getting help to those who need it most. At the same time, we urgently need the resources to sustain and expand efforts where we have access. International humanitarian law could not be clearer. All parties must allow safe, rapid, and unimpeded access to civilians in need, no matter where they are or who controls the territory. Mr. President, despite the growing scale of needs, funding remains critically low. Just 34% of the $2.6 billion required for the 2025 humanitarian needs and response plan has been received, forcing cuts to vital programs just as needs are soaring. Cash assistance, mental health support, and services to respond to gender-based violence have been slashed due to funding shortfalls. Without an immediate influx of resources, even prioritized programs will be at risk, just as the people of Ukraine approach a fourth wartime winter. Last week, the United Nations and our humanitarian partners launched the 2025-2026 Winter Response Plan, which aims to reach 1.7 million people with heating support, winter clothing, shelter repairs, emergency energy solutions, and cash. The plan prioritizes households in frontline and collective sites where freezing temperatures could turn already dire conditions into deadly ones. We urge member states to act now so that emergency supplies are in place before winter hits and conditions make it far harder to reach those in need. Mr. President, allow me to close with 3 urgent messages to this Council. First, civilians and civilian objects must be protected. The scale of civilian death and injury and the destruction to homes, schools, hospitals, and displacement centers must stop. Disproportionate and other indiscriminate attacks are strictly prohibited. Second, ensure humanitarian access. All parties must facilitate safe, rapid, and unimpeded access to civilians in need wherever they are. The Council and all member states must exert their influence to ensure civilians are protected and humanitarians can reach those in need. Third, support the response. Ukrainians cannot afford delays or donor fatigue. Every contribution counts. Mr. President, this war continues to inflict suffering on a staggering scale. The trauma is daily, the destruction is widespread, and the resilience of civilians is being pushed to its limits. But our commitment to assist them must not waver. Thank you.
I thank AST Masuya for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. And to begin with, I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General Masuya and Assistant Secretary General Yencha for their insight and contribution to today's discussion. And I welcome representative of Ukraine in the chamber. Mr. President, today's briefings painted a comprehensive picture of the latest developments on the ground, and the picture is grim. Civilian casualties are on the rise. Homes, schools, and hospitals continue to be destroyed. To top it all, there is no end in sight to all the death and suffering. Since the beginning of the year, Russia has been escalating its aggression. By March, Russia was launching more than 1,000 drones and missiles per week, terrorizing Ukrainians in their homes and shelters night after night. This month, the attacks have been particularly destructive. They culminated on the 9th of July, when Russia launched its largest ever aerial attack, using more than 700 drones and missiles. This vividly illustrates the accelerating pace of the escalation. This month alone, Russia has launched more than 5,000 drones and missiles. The ramped-up aerial attacks have a devastating impact on the civilian population, as we heard. As the briefers pointed out, the numbers of civilians killed or injured have been rising sharply in the first half of 2025. In fact, June was the deadliest month for Ukrainian civilians in 3 years. In addition to all this, civilians across Ukraine are each day exposed to arbitrary detentions, torture, executions, and sexual violence. These acts are an obvious violation of international humanitarian law. Slovenia condemns the aggression and the latest escalatory steps, Mr. President. Slovenia welcomes all diplomatic efforts toward a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, including the latest meeting between the two countries held last Wednesday. We welcome the agreement on the POW exchange in this regard. However, the outcomes of both previous and recent talks remain insufficient. Instead of genuine peace talks, we are witnessing a surge in drone production. Instead of respect for international law, more and more armaments are being procured, including from countries under UN sanctions. Instead of reuniting families, Ukrainian children remain displaced and deported. Instead of a ceasefire, Ukrainian cities continue to burn. Mr. President, we are in a desperate need of a change of pace. We need action to prevent further civilian deaths and finally make a decisive step on the path to peace, as implored by this Council last February. For months, we have listened to pleas of members of this Council for ceasefire. To little avail. Enough time has passed. This Council needs to act. We need a ceasefire resolution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would also like to thank Assistant Secretary Yencha and Assistant Secretary General Masuya for their briefings. Colleagues, we are once again gathered in this chamber to address Russia's ongoing illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, a war that continues to escalate in intensity as the Russian Federation persists in its aggression against its sovereign neighbor with increased ferocity. Mr. President, allow me to make 3 key points. First, in recent weeks, we have witnessed the most severe attacks against civilians across Ukraine in over 3 years. A relentless and sustained Russian blitz of drones, missiles, and bombs has inflicted death, destruction, and despair. Kyiv has been subjected to intense overnight missile and drone attacks. Since then, several other regions, including Dnipro, Kharkiv, Kherson, Odessa, Sumy, and Vinnytsia, also came under heavy attack. Deliberate assaults continue to be launched against civilian targets, from residential blocks and hospitals to shopping centers and other critical infrastructure. Nowhere is safe for Ukraine's civilians. In the last week alone, at least 20 civilians have been killed and more than 100 injured, including several children. Russia's claim that its armed forces only attack military targets is nothing more than this distortion of the truth. The reality on the ground tells a different story, as we also just heard from Assistant Secretary General Masuya. This is in clear violation of international humanitarian law and constitutes a callous disregard for civilians. Second, Mr. President, Russia's disregard for international law is having an outside impact on children who suffer some of the gravest consequences. For 3 consecutive years, the Russian armed forces have been listed in the annex of the Secretary General's annual report on children in armed conflict for committing grave violations against Ukrainian children. From the latest report, we have learned that Russia's actions in the past year have reached new levels of brutality. In addition to the unlawful abduction of thousands of Ukrainian children, Russian forces killed and maimed 671 children, according to the report. They also attacked over 500 schools and more than 300 hospitals. This marks a 60% increase in child casualties and a staggering 150% increase in attacks on schools and hospitals compared to 2023. We recall that civilian objects are protected under international humanitarian law and must not be targeted. Denmark fully supports the Secretary General's call for Russia to immediately cease all violations against children. We urge Russia to take concrete steps to prevent further violations by developing and implementing a joint action plan with the United Nations. Third, Mr. President, Russia's senseless, full-scale aggression continues in its 4th year. It must come to an end. For months, Ukraine has been ready to agree to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. We call on Russia to accept this offer without any delay. Such a response would reflect a genuine commitment to peace. While we welcome the agreement on new exchanges of prisoners of war reached in Istanbul this week, we cannot ignore that the Kremlin continues to pursue its illegal and brutal full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This week, Russia has continued to destroy cities, killing civilians, and targeting civilian infrastructure across Ukraine. These actions undermine the foundations for peace. Mr. President, in conclusion, while Russia's attacks intensify, we increase our support for Ukraine. We reiterate our call for a just, sustainable, and lasting peace in line with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. We have reaffirmed the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. Denmark will continue to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, until the Ukrainians can once again live in peace and freedom in their own country. I thank you.
Thank the representative of Denmark for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President.
Tout d'abord, je remercie
At the
Monsieur
outset,
le
I'd
Secrétaire
like to
Général
thank
Miroslav
ASG, Miroslav
et
Jenka,
Madame la Sous-Secrétaire Générale
and
Jos
ASG,
pour
Joyce
leurs exposés
Msuya.
qui nous rappellent
Thank
la
you for your
gravité de la
briefings,
situation.
which record
Monsieur
the
le
gravity
Président,
of the
il y a
situation.
une semaine,
President,
le
a week ago,
président ukrainien
President
a redit
Zelensky
qu'il était prêt à
said
engager
once
des
again that he
discussions
was
de paix
prepared
directes
to partake
avec
in
le
direct
président
peace
russe.
talks with the Russian president.
Quelle a été la réponse de la
What
Russie?
was Russia's response?
Des frappes massives
Massive
sur les
strikes
villes
on Ukrainian
ukrainiennes,
cities,
très loin du front,
very far
dans
from
la
the front
nuit du
line.
20 au
And
21
this
juillet.
between the 20th and 21st
Notre
of
ministre,
July.
M. Jean-Noël Barrot, est arrivé à
Our
Kiev
Minister of Foreign
quelques heures
Affairs,
plus tard
Jean-Noël Barrot,
pour
arrived
réitérer
in
notre
Kiev just a few hours
détermination
later to reiterate
à
our
accroître la
determination
pression sur la
to
Russie
increase
et à
pressure
donner
on
à
Russia
l'Ukraine les
and
moyens
to
de se
give
défendre.
Ukraine the
Nous
means
le
to defend
faisons
itself.
avec l'Union
This is what we're
européenne.
doing together with the European Union.
En attaquant systématiquement
By systematically
des cibles civiles
attacking
et
civilian
des
targets
infrastructures essentielles à la vie
and
quotidienne,
essential infrastructure,
la
essential
Russie
for
veut
daily
semer la
life,
peur et la division en
Russia
Ukraine.
is trying
Faute de
to
pouvoir
sow
percer sur le
fear
front
and discord
depuis
in
maintenant
Ukraine.
plus de 3 ans,
Unable to break
elle
through
tente
the
de
front
briser
line
l'arrière.
for over 3 years now,
La Russie
Russia
doit
is trying to
comprendre
break the rear guard.
que cette
Russia
stratégie de
must
violation
understand that this
massive et
strategy
systématique
of massive
droit
and
international
systematic
humanitaire et des
violation
conventions de
of
Genève
international
est non
humanitarian law and
seulement
the Geneva Conventions
illégale,
is not only
mais de
illegal,
surcroît inutile.
what's more is it's
La Russie ne
useless.
parviendra pas à
Russia
saper
will
le
not
moral du
manage
peuple ukrainien, dont
to
la France
erode
salue
the morale
la
of the Ukrainian
résilience
people.
et le
And
courage.
France would like to commend Ukraine's
La Russie vise
resilience and
aussi
courage.
systématiquement
France
les
is
infrastructures
also
énergétiques,
systematically targeting energy
n'hésitant
infrastructure.
pas à compromettre la
It is
sécurité et la
compromising without
sûreté
hesitation
nucléaire.
nuclear safety and security.
À Tchernobyl,
In Chernobyl,
notre ministre a pu
our
constater les
minister
dégâts
saw
considérables
considerable
provoqués en
damage
février dernier par un drone Shahed russe
that was done
qui a perforé le
in
sarcophage du
February by
confinement,
a Russian
servant à
Shahed
prévenir les
drone,
émissions radioactives.
a drone which perforated the
Monsieur le
confinement
Président, à
sarcophagus, which
Istanbul, il y a
prevents
2 jours,
radioactive emissions.
l'Ukraine a réitéré
President,
sa
in Istanbul 2 days ago,
disponibilité à
Ukraine
mettre en place
reiterated
un
its readiness
cessez-le-feu
to
immédiat
implement an
et sans
immediate and
condition,
unconditional
comme elle
ceasefire,
le fait depuis 5 mois.
as Ukraine has
La
been doing
Russie
for
l'a à
5
nouveau
months now.
refusé.
Russia
Elle a
once again
réitéré les
refused.
exigences
Russia
maximalistes
reiterated
contenues dans le
its
mémorandum
maximalist
qu'elle avait
demands
transmis
set
à
out in the
l'Ukraine le 2
memorandum
juin dernier.
it gave to
La Russie
Ukraine
ne
on the
peut
2nd of June.
exiger comme
Russia
condition à l'arrêt
cannot
du
demand
la capitulation de
Ukraine's
l'Ukraine.
capitulation as a
Monsieur le
precondition for
Président,
stopping
pour
the
être à la
hostilities.
hauteur de la
President,
responsabilité,
in order
ce
to live
Conseil
up
ne
to
peut
its
se contenter
responsibilities,
de déplorer
this
les
Council
souffrances
cannot
des
simply
civils et
deplore
appeler à des pourparlers
civilian
de paix.
suffering and
Le
call
Conseil
for peace talks.
Premièrement,
The Council
nommer les
must
choses et rappeler les
first call
fondamentaux
a
du
spade a
conflit.
spade and recall the
Face à l'aspiration
fundamentals
des
of the
Ukrainiens
conflict.
à la
Faced with
liberté et à la
Ukrainians' aspirations
démocratie,
to
c'est la
liberty
Russie
and democracy, it is
qui a
Russia,
envahi 2
which
fois
on 2
l'Ukraine,
occasions
en
invaded
2014
Ukraine in
et
2014 and
2022,
2022,
en violation
and this in
flagrante de la
flagrant
Charte.
violation of the Charter.
Deuxièmement, condamner
Second,
les
the Council must
violations du droit
condemn
international
violations of
humanitaire et des droits
international
de l'homme
humanitarian law and human rights
commises par
law,
la Russie et l'appeler
violations
à y
committed
mettre
by
fin.
Russia. We must
Les
call on
attaques
it to
indiscriminées
put an
contre
end
des
to this.
civils
Indiscriminate
constituent
attacks
des crimes
against
de guerre.
civilians constitute war crimes.
Troisièmement,
Third,
adresser
the Council
à la
must
Russie
address its appeals
appels à la
to
fin des combats.
Russia, its appeals
C'est
for
la
an end
Russie
to the fighting. It
qui
is
peut
Russia
immédiatement
which
mettre un
can
terme à cette
immediately
guerre
put an end
d'agression
to this war of
et
aggression
accepter le
and
cessez-le-feu.
accept a ceasefire.
Quatrièmement,
Fourth,
rappeler sans
we must
relâche
tirelessly
que la paix, pour
recall
être durable, doit
that
respecter le
peace,
droit
in
international.
order to be lasting,
Une
must
négociation
respect international
n'aboutira
law.
que si la Russie
Negotiations will only be
accepte de
effective
bonne foi
if Russia
et si elle se décide à
accepts these
respecter
negotiations in good faith
l'indépendance,
and if it agrees to
la
respect the
souveraineté
independence,
et
the sovereignty,
l'intégrité
and
territoriale
the
de
territorial
l'Ukraine,
integrity
qui doit
of
voir sa
Ukraine.
sécurité assurée pour l'avenir. Dans l'immédiat,
Ukraine's
l'urgence
future
est de nous
security
unir
must be
pour
upheld.
exiger un cessez-le-feu
In the immediate
complet,
future,
immédiat et
there's a pressing need
inconditionnel.
to call for a complete,
La
immediate, and
résolution
unconditional ceasefire.
2774,
This is what
votée par
Security
la
Council
Russie,
Resolution
demande
2774,
que soit mis fin au conflit
which
dans
Russia
le plus
voted in
bref délai.
favor, calls
Faisons la
for. It
respecter.
demands an end to the
Je vous
conflict as
remercie.
soon as possible. Let's respect it. I
I
thank you.
thank the representative of France for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank Pakistan for convening this meeting. I would also like to thank Assistant Secretary General Yensa and Assistant Secretary General Musuyev for their briefings. Mr. President, since the beginning of this war 3.5 years ago, the collective voice of the international community has repeatedly condemned Russia's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, and has been calling on Russia to fully respect international law, the UN Charter, and relevant General Assembly resolutions. These calls were strengthened with renewed conviction since the launching of the US-led peace initiative. Sadly, as we have just heard from our briefers, the war is not ending. On the contrary, for yet another month, Russian forces have been attacking the cities of Ukraine, causing death and destruction. June has been the single deadliest month for Ukrainian civilians since at least May 2022, with the number of missiles and loitering munitions launched by Russia into Ukraine increasing tenfold from June 2024. Once more, the vulnerable, children, women, and the elderly are disproportionately affected, with 100 casualties among children alone. This trend has continued in July. These attacks have inter alia targeted energy infrastructure and disrupted power supply to the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant for the first time since December 2023, further endangering nuclear safety. We note with extreme concern that according to the WHO, nearly 40% of all attacks against healthcare facilities worldwide this year took place in Ukraine, causing casualties among medical personnel and patients. We are likewise concerned about reports on the use of chemical weapons, and we also condemn any attacks against civilians which constitute blatant violations of international law, including humanitarian and human rights law. Mr. President, this year's annual report of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict verified a 105% increase in grave violations against the children of Ukraine, identifying for the third consecutive year the Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups as responsible for these violations. These findings are compounded by this year's recently released Council of Europe's report on the human rights situation in the territories of Ukraine temporarily occupied by Russia, which demonstrates that Russia's war of aggression has continued to lead to immense human suffering. Mr. President, ensuring accountability is both a prerequisite for peace and a deterrent for further war. On that front, Greece welcomes the July 9th ruling of the European Court of Human Rights, in which the court held Russia unanimously accountable for flagrant and widespread abuses of at least 10 fundamental human rights in eastern Ukraine between 2014 and at least 2022. Greece also welcomes the signing of the agreement between the Council of Europe and Ukraine for the establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Mr. President, we have long advocated for peace, which is long overdue. We welcome the 3 rounds of direct bilateral talks and the agreements on exchange of prisoners, including the most recent one on July 23rd. However, we regret that peace efforts have not produced any other tangible results and have eventually stalled. We reiterate that no peace effort can have any substantial results if hostilities continue. Therefore, it is imperative that any peace efforts should be approached in good faith, starting by agreeing to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire as the first step towards a comprehensive, just and lasting peace, in line with international law and the UN Charter, and in full respect of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. Now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I also would like to thank ASG Yencha and ASG Msuya for their informative briefings and welcome the participation of Ukraine in today's meeting. Mr. President, as the war in Ukraine stretches beyond 1,250 days, the human, moral, economic, and geopolitical costs of this aggression continues to mount. Contrary to the hopes of many who yearns to escape from this dark tunnel, Russia is intensifying its relentless attacks, now deploying hundreds of deadly drones and missiles daily. Indeed, June marked the highest monthly civilian casualty toll in 3 years, with 232 killed and 1,343 wounded. The humanitarian situation in Ukraine continues to deteriorate, and civilian suffering is deepening. We reiterate that such large-scale and indiscriminate attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure constitute a clear violations of international humanitarian law. The Republic of Korea once again strongly calls for a full, immediate, and unconditional cessation of hostilities to prevent further civilian casualties. In this regard, we support the recent call by the United States to achieve a long overdue ceasefire within 50 days. And we urge Russia to respond to this call, one that has been echoed by nearly every other member of the international community. Now more than ever, as the casualties continue to mount and the war shows no signs of abating. The urgency for a ceasefire is undeniable. We have already witnessed the concrete benefits of such a ceasefire during another major ongoing conflict. Although the humanitarian situation in Gaza remains dire today, earlier this year, during the fleeting ceasefire in Gaza, humanitarian conditions on the ground markedly improved. Hundreds of aid trucks were able to enter Gaza, delivering much-needed food, medicine, and other humanitarian supplies to suffering Palestinians. This clearly demonstrates that an immediate halt to hostilities is not merely symbolic. It is a vital step toward alleviating civilian suffering and creating the necessary space for diplomacy. On another front, we also take note of the third round of talks recently held between Ukraine and Russia in Istanbul to seek an end to the conflict and bring about sustainable peace. We do not expect a miraculous breakthrough from just a few meetings. However, we do hope for the restoration of normalcy for the innocent civilians who have endured more than 3 years of immense hardship. They need a respite from the terrible nightly drone swarms, now numbering in the hundreds each day. We believe the realistic path to ending this war and achieving lasting peace begins with a prompt ceasefire agreement, followed by a sustained negotiations supported by confidence-building measures such as prisoner exchanges and the return of fallen soldiers. These efforts must not be used to buy time for destructive or territorial ambitions, but instead must reflect the genuine political will to end this war. Mr. President, a major obstacle to achieving these goals lies in the ongoing military cooperation between Russia and the DPRK. Despite repeated condemnations from the international community, this illicit collaboration has been prolonging the war in Ukraine by enabling the large-scale transfer of ammunition, artillery, and missiles from the DPRK to Russia, as well as the deployment of North Korean troops in a flagrant violation of the UN Charter and relevant Security Council resolutions. Moreover, such cooperation poses grave risks to the security of the Republic of Korea and to regional stability. Potential military assistance and technological transfer from Russia to DPRK represent a serious and growing threat to the safety of the Korean people and to broader peace in Northeast Asia. We reiterate that all forms of cooperation between Moscow and Pyongyang must fully comply with relevant Security Council resolution and international law. In closing, Mr. President, the international community can no longer afford to stand idly by while this senseless war continues. This is why we must come together, raising a united voice to demand an immediate ceasefire and pursue a just and lasting peace. We sincerely hope that those who initiate this war will heed the principled call of the international community. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thanking the representative of Republic of Korea for the statement, I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to thank ASG Yanka and ASG Monsieur for your informative briefings today. Colleagues, the world has rallied around President Trump's call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. Ukraine has agreed, and we echo that call again today. Yet week after week, night after night, we see the number of Russian assaults grow. June was the deadliest month yet, and July is on track to be even deadlier. This makes a mockery of the diplomacy that Russia claims to support. And the consequences are even more devastating for the people of Ukraine. Across 5 nights, from the 18th to the 23rd of July, Russia launched over 940 drones and 59 missiles at Ukrainian cities, killing 20 civilians and injuring a further 216. Just days before, a record-breaking 728 long-range drones were launched on Ukraine in a single day. Since the start of the invasion, over 13,500 civilians have been killed and more than 34,000 injured. This includes more than 200 children killed or injured since March alone. We cannot allow ourselves to become desensitized to these figures. Behind each Russian strike, there is a person, a family, a community whose lives have been torn apart by Russia's brutal military invasion. The Shigids are one such family. On the 5th of June, as a Ukrainian firefighter arrived at the scene of a Russian attack on Chernihiv, he discovered that his wife, his daughter, and his grandson had all been killed. His grandson was only a year old. 3 generations lost to cold-blooded Russian brutality in just one night. This is not an isolated incident. Families like the Shigids are being torn apart across Ukraine and have been since February 2022. Russia has a clear and unqualified obligation to uphold the UN Charter. Russia also has an obligation to respect the Geneva Conventions and to the protection of civilians under international humanitarian law. There is simply no justification for brutal aggression like this. The reality is clear. Ukraine, a country illegally invaded by Russia, continues to show its commitment to peace. But President Putin prefers war. He is shunning diplomatic efforts made in good faith to bring an end to this horror, a horror of his own making. There is no ambiguity about what needs to come next. It is time for Russia to stop prevaricating and agree to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire as the first step towards a just and lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening today's meeting. I would also like to thank Assistant Secretaries General Yencha and Masuya for the updates provided and for their work. In the 33 days that have elapsed since our last meeting on this topic, the situation on the ground has gotten considerably worse. The continuation of intense fighting in several regions and escalated attacks on civilian infrastructure continue to devastate civilian lives and drive displacement in Ukraine. Meanwhile, nuclear safety and security remain under threat, with the IAEA reporting yesterday that their team at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant continues to hear shelling, explosions, and gunfire almost every day. Earlier this month, the site's training center was targeted in a drone strike, resulting in damage to its roof. Guyana deplores the ongoing attacks on or near nuclear power stations, given the risk of severe and indiscriminate harm that could result. We call on the parties to the conflict to eliminate such plans from their military strategies. Mr. President, we have been consistent in reaffirming full respect for the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. Likewise, we have also been consistent in calling for a peaceful end to this war. We welcome the talks that have taken place in Istanbul and join fellow Council members in welcoming the recent agreement for another round of exchanges of prisoners of war. Nevertheless, we have noted that these periods of progress continue to be interrupted by increased attacks and heightened rhetoric. We urge the parties to ensure that progress is sustained by prioritizing the protection of civilians, fulfilling their international legal obligations, and ultimately agreeing to end this war peacefully and definitively. Guyana believes that many opportunities have been missed since the adoption of Resolution 2774 5 months ago, a resolution which, while not perfect, provided the first glimmer of hope since this conflict erupted. 5 months on, it appears as if the main obstacles